Hey guys, how's it going? It's Rob Sutton, and today we are looking at this Tamron 28-75mm f2.8 that I'm actually shooting with right now, and that whole intro sequence was shot with. And we're also going to enjoy a double IPA while we're doing this. Today we're looking at the Wild Leap Alpha Abstraction Double IPA. This is the 5th installment of this series. It's dry hopped with Nelson Sauvin hops. Not really sure what that means other than they are from New Zealand. It's supposed to be really good, and the artwork on the front of the can is actually a photograph of Krog Street Tunnel downtown that has a bunch of graffiti, so really cool kind of local vibe to that. They're a brewery right down in LaGrange, Georgia, which is actually south of Atlanta, closer to Alabama, went up north of town, but it is a semi-local brewery that's really making a splash around the southeast. You might have seen it in other places, but they're doing a great job. So really enjoying it. Let's take a look at this beer, let's take a look at the lens, and let's get started. And I mean, seriously, how can you not like a juicy IPA that has this quote on the back of the can? Sir Mix-a-Lot for the win. Big butts and I cannot lie. Yeah, it's really kind of keeping to that hazy IPA thing we got going lately. Well, at 8%, it's not like a super heavy double IPA, but it's definitely that citrus, hazy. It's good. This lens has really been making a splash because we're really looking for kind of these third-party lenses to come out for the Sony E-mount, and Sigma came out with their art series, and now Tamron's jumping on the bandwagon with this 28-75 f2.8. So first, let's get into the pricing, which is actually what kind of drove everything for this lens in the very beginning. Coming out at $879, it is incredibly affordable, especially for enthusiasts when it comes to a 24-70-ish zoom range that holds at f2.8 through the entire range. The closest you can get at this point in that price range for a Sony E-mount is their Sony Vario series, which I actually have their 16-35, which is really nice, but it is an f4, not an f2.8. If you want an f2.8 in this zoom range, you have to go to the Sony G Master, which is over $2,000. If we want to get specific, $21.98 on Amazon right now. So you're talking about a really big premium to go up to the G Master series, which has an f2.8 all the way through the zoom range. In comparison, the Sony Vario lens is actually $798, but it is f4, and you will see a huge price difference typically going from f4 to f2.8. So with this lens, you would expect it to have a lot of decent features with it just because it's f2.8, but with the cost, you would actually expect it to be a downfall in a lot of way to the G Master lens. So let's get into the good parts of this lens first, then we'll get into the bad, and then I'll talk about who this is really meant for and whether or not I'd recommend it or not. So one of the things I was really surprised about is the focus drive in this lens. Call it their RXD focus drive. What you will notice when it comes to photography and video, the focus is lightning quick and silent. As you can see, it's very quick and silent, and I really don't notice any difference in speed between this and say my 70-200 f4 that I also have from Sony, or the 16-35 f4. It's really on point and fast, and it seems to lock on perfectly, and it also applies to eye autofocus, which it also does very well. Also, one of the crazy things I noticed about this lens is how close you can get to the lens and still get in focus. It says 0.19 meters, which equals out to 0.62 feet. As you can see, we can get this can crazy close to the lens and still have it in focus. That is awesome to have out of this 24-70 range. It allows you to get really close to subjects and act almost like a macro lens. So for comparison, the G Master series from Sony, which is, over 2 times the amount, the cost, only goes to 1.24 feet. And the Sony Vario only goes to 1.3 feet. So what you're really talking about here is you can get twice as close to this lens as you can from one of the really more expensive counterparts and the f4 variant from Sony. Sony really hit a home run with this, and this is something I use a lot in video production, but also in photos. It gives the lens just that much wider of a range, and especially when you come down to like the 75 end, where you might not be able to get as close, but it really creates separation from close subjects and the background in a really tight situation. So one of the things you typically worry about with these cheaper lenses, I say cheap, it's not really cheap, it's more budget lenses that are coming from third-party manufacturers, is that the bokeh quality will be kind of abnormal or come out in really weird shapes. I find with this lens, typically you get really round bokeh out of the background when you're really trying to blur it out when you're down at f2.8. Like right now we could take an example with those lights in the background. So you can see where you get a little bit of abnormality in a couple of them, especially towards the edges. Right there towards the center next to the glass, you'll see that they're really round and nice and soft. So overall quality, while it's not on par with maybe like some of the really higher end lenses, especially for the cost, I think it's pretty good. And now we'll take a look at the still image that I took, and still, the quality of the Christmas lights behind me while out of focus really look kind of circular and nice. You are gonna get a little bit softer, nicer bokeh out of more expensive lenses, but for this price point, it looks excellent. So another really big plus of this lens is it really matches the Sony mirrorless camera bodies very well. Part of the reason I went to Sony from Canon is my 5D Mark III kit started to get incredibly big. When it came to the lenses, it came to the body, anything of the accessories, it got to be a lot to carry around. So one of the nice things about going to the Sony mirrorless system was a lot more compact form factor that made it so I actually ended up taking the camera a lot more places because it wasn't so bulky. In comparison with the Sony G Master 2.8, is a lot smaller and lighter. And this fits a lot better with this camera format. So for comparison, this Tamron lens weighs 550 grams in comparison to the Sony G Master, which is 885 grams. It's also 4.6 inches long versus 5.35 inches long with the Sony. It's just a lot more portable than you will find with the G Master series for relatively the same image and video quality. Another thing I love about this lens is it's actually crazy sharp. I've had a couple Tamron lenses in the past and they've always been incredibly sharp. I've really loved the picture quality. They've always been on par with my Canon L lenses or some of my Nikon lenses that I've had in the past. So I really came to expect this one to be super sharp, and it was just like I expected. All right, so not everything's perfect. We are getting a budget lens here, so there are some drawbacks that you get for the price. One is they list this lens as water resistant. Not really sure what that means. There's not a big O-ring on the back of it. The body doesn't look very well sealed. So what you're gonna run into if you're in a lot of rain situations, wildlife, outside, really dusty situations, you might see that Sony G Master as a good compromise, even though it is a lot more expensive to get that weather seal. The flip side to that is you could almost buy 3 of these for the price of the G Master, so does it become a throwaway item at that point? Who knows? It really is going to come up to you, but I wouldn't expect this lens to really hold up well in really wet or dusty conditions. Just be aware of that getting into it. So the other thing about this lens is the build quality. I'm not gonna lie, even by Tamron standards, the build quality of this lens feels a little bit cheap. You used to get kind of this soft touch feel on the Tamron lenses, kind of like what you got with the older Sigma lenses, and this feels like really hard plastic. Cheap plastic at that. For the price point for a 2.8 zoom lens like this, I wasn't really expecting it to be over the top nice, but even in comparison with like the Sigma Art series that has come out recently, this really does feel like a cheap lens. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. So if you're really big on touch and feel, it might be an issue for you. So I can only really see this being an issue in one really big circumstance, and that is if you are in a professional photography situation where people are looking at your lens because of the amount of money that you're charging them. Otherwise, not really a big deal, you just kind of get used to it. So the other thing is this is a 28 to 75 zoom range, which is outside of the industry standard of a 24 to 70, which means is you lose 4 millimeters on the wide end. Not really sure why they did that. I probably could research it and find out. Probably has something to do with the size and weight would be my best guess. But keep in mind you do lose those 4 mil while you gain it on the other end. So here I'm gonna show you on my 16 to 35 what that 4 millimeters actually makes in difference on the wide end. It's not that big of a deal to me because I use my 16 to 35 for anything that I want super wide, even when it is f4. The only reason that would hurt was in low light situations where you might have to use a longer shutter speed. But on the wider end, the aperture as far as depth of field doesn't mean as much. So just keep that in mind while using it. You might have to reframe things. You are also not going to get the advanced features like you would with the G Master with programmable buttons and a manual switch for manual focus to autofocus. You have to do that all in body. So again, it's one more step you have to take because you don't have those premium features. So another thing I didn't really like that I wasn't really expecting out of this lens is you have the zoom ring and focus ring swapped. really wouldn't be that big a deal. But a lot of times I like to swap the lens hood just for a storage sake on the lens itself while I'm using any kind of variable filters, whether it be a circular polarizer or ND filter, so I can actually turn it like I want to, especially in cloudy situations where you're really not worried about lens flare because of the sun. It puts it right in the way of the zoom ring. So when you're trying to frame your shot, unless you have the barrel out, if you're trying to go wide, your fingers have to kind of manually go in around the lens hood when you're just trying to store it because you're not using it. Again, it's a little annoyance, but it's something I never had to worry about before, and really wouldn't have been an issue if they just would have kept the zoom ring right where it was supposed to be. There's probably some design reason behind that, again, that I don't know about, but it did create a unique situation for me where I did have an annoyance just using the lens. So another weird annoyance for me with the lens that is really another just small deal is that it uses a 67mm filter size, where all of my other lenses are 72. So I do have to use an adapter, which can run into issues if I'm using a circular polarizer with vignetting. Again, it's a small issue because they wanted to keep the lens a compact size. And with that compromise, you get a smaller front element, which means you get a 67mm versus a 72. So you can either buy all new filters or you can use an adapter. The last downside that I do need to mention, even though it didn't affect me personally, is that the first firmware of this lens ran into focus issues. I didn't personally have it. This lens was shipped with version 0.2. and I have not found any focus issues whatsoever with this lens. As you can see, we could pick up this can and it points right on. And then right back on me, back on the can. I just didn't have that issue, but it was well publicized, so I thought it was worth mentioning. If you were ever buying this lens to use, make sure you update the firmware. Otherwise, you're gonna run into those focus issues. So guys, that is my review of the 28-75 2.8 from Tamron for the Sony E-mount. It's an incredible lens, especially for the price. When you even consider just the drawbacks of the lens, which I almost expect just from being at the price point, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to buy the more expensive G Master unless you really just have to have the weather sealing and the look of an expensive lens because of what you're charging whatever you are for your project. For any enthusiast, I wouldn't even think about the G Master. I'd buy this right away. Guys, we enjoyed a good beer, we enjoyed a good lens, and I will link everything down in the description below what we talked about today. And as always, please like this video if you liked it, thumbs down if you don't, and subscribe and hit that notification button for more videos. We'll be doing a lot more here soon. So that's all I've got today. Appreciate it, guys. Thanks. On to the next one.